I've known my guest this week, Hind Hassan, for several years, since we first worked as correspondents at Vice News Tonight. But because we had such similar roles, we never actually got to work together, meaning I've mostly watched her career just like everyone else, as a fan. Hind is one of those reporters who it feels almost boring to describe as brave. She's covered just about every recent war you can think of: Gaza, Afghanistan, Ukraine. In 2022, she went to Lebanon to cover a society that was in economic freefall, with desperate citizens taking to robbing banks just to access their own funds. And she reported from inside a bank, being held up by a man armed with a pistol. My favorite thing she does, better than almost anyone else in my opinion, is confronting people directly with pointed questions that they'd rather not answer. In 2021, she knocked on the door of an American settler living in an East Jerusalem home taken from a Palestinian family and asked him, "What right do you have to live here?" These days, she's turning that critical eye on the journalism industry, which she believes has failed to rise to the occasion when it comes to protecting our own in Gaza. Hin, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
You recently spoke at Columbia, actually, at the commencement for some of the journalism school students. And I was struck by something you said. You apologized for our generation not making the job safer for their generation, which initially I thought it was a strange thing to say because I don't tend to think of us journalists as having more of a role than just being observers of history. But I think you were saying something very specific about what's been happening now, what's been happening in Gaza in particular, where this industry has sort of failed to rise to the occasion. Is that kind of what you were getting at?
I think there's two different things about what our roles are. You've got your role as a journalist, which is observers of history or, however you define it. We go out, we report, we tell the stories. But on the other hand, we're also all part of an industry. We make up the journalistic industry. So therefore, we're responsible for what our industry stands for. We have ethics and policies that we talk about all the time. We always talk about what it is to be a journalist, what's right and wrong to be a journalist. Is it okay for a journalist to do this or not okay for a journalist to do that? And we're very often defining what it is to be a reporter and one that is respected. And so if that is the case, why is safety not included in that? And I do think it is the responsibility of the industry, of those who have the power, of those who, are heads of news organizations to defend journalists when they come under attack, no matter where they are. And very often they do that. They do that. And we often see all the different journalistic awards giving honorary awards to, journalists of Afghanistan, the journalists of Ukraine,
Hmm.
because we know that it is important. Because if there is an attack against journalists, if we see them being targeted in one particular place or area, whether it be online, whether it be in real life, then we know that threat can spread and it can impact other journalists as well. And so I do think it's our responsibility. And also, I speak to so many students, and so many of them say to me, I'm having doubts about this industry and I haven't even started yet. They're
Hmm.
watching what's happening to journalists in Gaza. They're watching the news and they feel disenfranchised, some of them, and some of them feel frustrated with what they're seeing and the response to it. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, I think it is our duty to be good journalists, to be great journalists on one hand, and also to be the voices of other journalists when they're under attack.
You mentioned sort of awards, and I've actually heard you talk about this before, but specifically the Pulitzers, right, which are administered here at Columbia, that have honored the journalists of Afghanistan, the journalists of Ukraine, but use different language when talking about Palestinian journalists in Gaza.
Yeah, when it came to what's happening in Gaza, it was journalists reporting on Gaza, which includes me, includes you. And that's a very different language to the journalists of Afghanistan, the journalists of Ukraine. And we understand that those awards that are being given at the time is aimed at raising and elevating and appreciating and recognizing the impact and the dedication and the sacrifice that is being made by journalists who are not only reporting from a war zone, reporting accurately, concisely, professionally, artistically, every word that you can use to describe, but they're also experiencing the war.
Yeah.
And, you know, actually, if you, a big misconception is, you know, journalists who are, you know, experiencing whatever, then they are biased. First of all, if you are a journalist in the UK or America, you don't have that accusation levied at you. But
Mm-hmm.
say, for example, when you watch journalists in Ukraine or journalists in Sudan or journalists in Gaza, what I see is incredible professionalism. When I watch the reporters live on Al Jazeera, I see reporters being professional, being focused, just reporting the facts of what they are seeing. They're doing an incredible job. And these awards are a recognition of what they are going through. There is a big difference between reporting from a place that is safe, and there is still incredible work, obviously, and very important work and much needed work from so-called, you know, democratic countries or whatever. But it's a recognition of the threat to life and the obstacles and the difficulties that these journalists face when reporting from some of the most dangerous places in the world. So to recognize the journalists of Afghanistan, to recognize the journalists of Ukraine, and then to say those who have reported on Gaza, people are going to notice that, and they're going to wonder why. And they're going to feel lesser, and they're going to feel different. And so I think that's been obvious to a lot of people, and we've definitely seen that. And it's concerning and it's upsetting, because we are united as journalists. You know, we should be united as journalists, and we should all feel an affinity with each other. But if one group of journalists are very specifically, clearly being treated differently, then that is concerning, not just for them, but for also other people who are aspiring to become journalists or thinking about it.
Do you think you could talk a little bit about the journalists in Gaza? Because you've worked with them on documentaries. Recently, you did one called "Starving Gaza," which long predated the more general public's understanding of what was happening there in terms of food and humanitarian aid. Can you talk about the specific journalists you've worked with and what they can bring to the stories that you're telling?
So when we started working with the journalists in Gaza for the Fault Lines documentary, the Al Jazeera documentary that we made, that's also called Starving Gaza, our communication was very thin at the time because of bombardments, because of reception being cut off. And so sometimes we wouldn't hear for a while from them, and then the footage would come in. And I just remember the first time that I saw the footage that they had filmed, and it was so brilliantly filmed. The framing, the cinematography. I was really, really impressed and surprised at how well they were able to film despite everything that they were experiencing, despite the lack of safety gear, the lack of camera gear, the ability to charge their kit or to have spare batteries or to have the right lens. And yet they still managed to film this really these hauntingly powerful scenes. And again, the professionalism was just second to none. We at one point we filmed a scene, as we'd call it in a documentary, which is I was in Washington and I wanted to speak to one of the doctors who was working at the Kamal Adwan Hospital in the north of Gaza, Dr. Ahmed. I still speak to him now, actually. He's no longer at Kamal Adwan Hospital, of course. And
Wait, why? Of course, sorry, dumb question, but why? Of course.
because Kamal Adwan Hospital has been attacked numerous times, and they are no longer. He was working with malnourished children in a unit in the Kamal Adwan Hospital, and that's no longer there, so he can't work there. And Kamal Adwan Hospital has been reported on quite extensively. The head of the hospital was taken in by the Israeli military, and we still don't know where he is now, and it has come under attack repeatedly. So I was calling him from Washington to talk to him about what the situation was like at Dwan Hospital at the time and some of the cases that they were seeing of the malnourished children. And the data kept cutting off, the reception kept cutting off. And so every
I think you were
time...
sitting in front of the White House for this shot. Is that right?
Yeah, I was sitting in
I'm
front
trying
of
to
the White
picture.
House. I had a
Yeah.
phone. I was talking to him on the phone. So he was on his phone. I was on my phone. I had a camera crew on me filming me talking to him. And he also had a camera crew filming him whilst he was talking to me. And yeah, we got cut off maybe, I can't remember exactly, 4, 5, 6 times. I can't remember. But it was a lot. And they just continued. They kept calling back and they picking up the conversation where it was, completely calm, very professional. I was getting frustrated. I was in Washington. I was like, oh my God, keeps cutting out. And they just, of course, they're used to it. This is nothing compared to everything else they've had to experience. You know, the bombed out roads, or being attacked in the middle of filming, or suddenly the person that they're filming has been displaced again or has been killed. So this is nothing. They've experienced absolutely everything. And also you have to remember, like, I worked with journalists, our team worked with journalists in Gaza, really fantastic filmmakers. But everything that you see on your screens or read in papers or online that is coming out of Gaza has had the hand of a Gaza journalist on it.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you see a report on the latest attack in Gaza or bombardment or the GHF or the aid distribution sites or whatever it is, there are journalists in Gaza who worked on that. You might not see their names, you might not see their faces, they might not be the correspondent on the piece, they might not be byline necessarily on the piece, but there are reporters working on it. And so that's the thing. There've been so many reporters in Gaza have been dehumanized or have been attacked or been labeled as terrorists, and yet there would be nothing coming out of Gaza without them.
Yeah, and then killed, right? I mean,
and of course killed at a higher level than any other conflict in the world that has been recorded in terms of death rate.
Yeah.
You know, last year was the most dangerous year for journalists ever, and then the year before that was the most dangerous year for journalists ever, and both of it was as a result of Gaza. And you know, very likely this year will be the same.
When I spoke to Arwa Damon for this podcast, she made an observation which I think is sort of controversial but also maybe obvious, which is that had there been more international journalists inside Gaza, as painful as it is to say this, there would have been probably more attention on what had been going on. And then we saw, in a weird way, this sort of proof of it the other day when those aid flights flew over the country and Western journalists, British journalists mostly, take pictures out the window and you see the flattened landscape of Gaza and it sort of goes viral, right? There's a sense of like, oh my God, can you believe what's happening there? What do you feel in those moments? Do you feel a sense of, well, it's good that there is this sort of international voice lending credibility to this, or do you feel frustrated that this is what it takes?
A bit of both. And also we have to remember that before talking about, you know, the perceived credibility of international journalists versus Gaza journalists, we have to recognize that this is by design. It's not by accident. Oh, journalists couldn't get in because it was too dangerous, and so this is just the byproduct of that. This is by design. It didn't just happen after October 7th that the crossings into Gaza were suddenly closed and journalists weren't allowed in. Every time there has been a bombardment of Gaza, every time Israel has bombed Gaza, they have closed the entry points into Gaza and prevented international journalists from entering. One of the first times I remember following what was happening in Gaza was in 2008, when I was studying my own master's in journalism, and Israel was bombing Gaza. They closed the entry points. International journalists were not allowed in. There were two Al Jazeera journalists who were in at the time, international Al Jazeera journalists, so not from Gaza, who were just there at the time. They just happened to be there when the crossings were closed. But apart from that, journalists were not allowed in, and they were pressuring the Israeli government to let them go in and that they wanted to go and report. And even then in 2008, there were reports of media officers being attacked. And this has happened every single time. I went into Gaza in 2021 after that bombardment, which was, I think, 11 days. And at that point, before we were allowed in, we were contacting the Israeli Information Ministry. We were online calling for us to be allowed in. And then when the ceasefire took hold, all of us just sped to the crossing to get into Gaza because we knew that the crossing might be opened and we might be able to get in. So this is something that has happened repeatedly and regularly. And the impact of it is that at the time of the bombardment taking place, there aren't international journalists there to specifically report for their international news organizations. And then the Gaza journalists who are there are being dehumanized, and we're being told that they are not real journalists and that they are affiliated to terrorists or are terrorists themselves. And so what you have there is, oh, don't believe the people on the ground. And okay, but we're also not going to allow the international journalists in. So that is by design.
So then the question, though, is like, we write about the industry and we pay attention to how, but it is real that regardless of this policy, which is clear policy by the Israelis not to let in journalists, there is a real difference when you get the sort of outside journalists to come in, right? And I wonder if that feels both, okay, phew, I'm glad they're doing it, or if it feels like, what the hell is this? Why does it take this? Or some combination of the two.
Of course, yeah. And this is something that we're constantly calling for a reflection on, and we are calling out all the time. And we would like that to change. And at the moment, it hasn't changed. And we need to do what we can right now to be able to go in and report and to be able to get as much out of Gaza as possible. And that is unfortunately one of the things that we need to do. And on top of that, I will also say, it's also about the fact that the journalists who have been inside Gaza, they've been reporting now for 22 months, and they are exhausted and they have not had any reprieve. Even if they've wanted to take some time out for themselves, they've had to listen to the sound of drones and bombs.
There have been journalists who've had to report on the killing of their own family and then go back to doing their job in the same hour.
Yeah, there are journalists who were live on air as they received information about a particular camp that has been hit, and they've realized that's where their family members are, or that they have reported on the death of their own family members or their own colleagues. And on top of that, there are many of them who've received death threats, or people will no longer associate with them because they're journalists, and so they are afraid of being targeted for being connected to a journalist. And then on top of that, I don't think there's a single person in the whole of Gaza who is not struggling with their mental health. So put aside the injuries, the death, the destruction, the displacement, then you have any mental health on top of that, issues on top of that, and lack of safety gear. A lot of them say, what's the point in safety gear? It's not going to protect you if a missile lands where you are, or you're hit by a drone. And so there are all these different experiences that they have been forced to live through. And so I think they need backup. We need to go in because they've been reporting for 22 months non-stop. And that is, I don't know how they've done it. It sounds like an impossible feat, but they are still doing it. They are still reporting. They are still getting really important information out there, but we need to go in there to work alongside them and to support them. And also because, yes, I think perhaps this would have stopped at some point had there been international journalists inside, which is incredibly sad to think that one life is more important than the other in the eyes of some people.
This brings me back in a way to the question that I was asking you at the beginning, which maybe feels obvious now, but I was wondering what you were saying about what you said to the students. There is a universality to it, and I wonder if there's something about this particular moment that really brings that out versus these sort of universal themes of this industry not being that stable and not feeling particularly safe. And I heard you say on another podcast at some point that the last couple of years have sparked a kind of existential crisis for you about this job. I wonder what that was about.
I think when I talk about this, I reflect the feelings of many people.
Mm.
And not just, I think, actually, I know. I've spoken to so many people who work for every news organization, all the mainstream networks and all the media organizations that we know. And there are lots and lots of people who've had the same experience and are saying the same thing. And that is that they have felt othered since October the 7th, and that they have felt sidelined or side-eyed, or I don't know, should we have that journalist name on this? Should we have a Middle Eastern name, directing, producing, editing,
Mm.
or whatever? And it's definitely a consideration that people have experienced. And then, of course, there are many people who are working hard, and I've seen a lot of really great documentaries, powerful documentaries, news reports, investigations that have come out. And a lot of people can't say it out loud because it's a long journey to get to where you are as a journalist, and they're fearful for their jobs and their future.
Yeah.
But I lived through the Iraq War, and that was a time when I recall very clearly how being an Arab was synonymous with terrorism for a lot of people. Like, if someone asked me where I was born and I'd say Iraq, you kind of immediately you have a raised eyebrow, or are like, oh, and
Mm-hmm.
and that's just what you're defined by. And a lot of us felt like, oh, we've moved on from that. Society's moved on from that. This is really great. We've progressed, we've evolved, we've developed. And then suddenly it felt like that time again. It felt like we were being judged based on our backgrounds or the way that we were reporting on this, which is no different to how anyone would report on any other conflict, war, or bombardment. If something was happening in the United Kingdom, God forbid, then I think the journalists here, they would be reporting on, the victims in exactly the same way, as we all do when we go to Ukraine and when we go to other places. But it
Right.
feels like with this, it's been different. And this is definitely the feeling of a lot of journalists from the Middle East and beyond. So not just the Middle East, there are, journalists from many different parts of the world who seem to have that same feeling and experience.
Well, I've noticed that you have done a lot of your work in the last couple of years for places like Al Jazeera and Middle East Eye. Do you feel like these are outlets where you can sort of say more clearly what you see happening in a way that's harder in other places?
I mean, Middle East Eye and Al Jazeera gave me an opportunity to be able to consistently report on what is happening in Gaza and other places. As someone who makes news documentaries, did it at Vice, as you did,
Mm-hmm.
and as we know, there are fewer and fewer places that are making news documentaries or have the budget for it. And then when they do make a news documentary on Gaza, it's kind of like, okay, we've commissioned documentary. We have one already, or we have both these departments. One has an investigation, one has we have our news team there. It's very difficult to get things commissioned at the moment. And the great thing about working with Al Jazeera is that they have multiple documentary platforms that allow you to, work on, make documentaries on Gaza. We've also made other documentaries. We released a documentary last year on the role of social media in the UK riots. So, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's just it's brilliant to be able to collaborate with an organization that is continuing to put resources and funding into the art of news documentaries, which is it's just getting harder and harder, and the purse strings are getting tighter. And then, if you want to report on the things that you think are really important at this particular time, then you're very, very limited with where you can go.
Yeah. Will you tell me a little bit about this new series, Business of War, you're doing for Al Jazeera?
Yeah, so I think we're currently broadcasting the second episode now, and that episode is on nuclear weapons. But basically, it is a 4-part series which looks into the business of war. So the organizations, the companies behind the war machine, and how intertwined they are with the corridors of power, the politicians, and those who make decisions. And basically we unravel that it is a very messy business, and the tentacles of these businesses are absolutely everywhere. And so for a few of the episodes, we go to the US, we go to the Senate, and we try and track down some people to ask them some questions about conflicts of interest. Because of course, sending an email in and saying, hi, we'd love to talk to you about the donations that your campaign has received from X company, doesn't normally get a very positive response
Right.
from politicians.
Including Democrats, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think I saw, but I imagine we're going to get a bunch of really classic Hind moments where you go up to someone and ask them a very direct and uncomfortable question with no sign of discomfort on your part. Just here's the facts. How do you deal with it? It's one of your skills that I've always admired.
It's definitely thank you. And it's definitely one of my favorite parts of the job is getting the question to the person. Let's not have an email get in the way of putting the question to somebody we think that needs to have that question put to them. One of the most surreal moments was when we came across Senator Susan Collins, and wanted to ask her about her husband's shares in some of the weapons manufacturers. And when I put it to her, she looks completely confused and baffled by what I was saying. And I questioned myself. I was like, have I got this wrong? Did I get this information wrong? Because she looked at me like she had no idea what I was talking about. It was a very good tactic, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a lot of the senators would just walk on by and just rush to whatever meeting they had or to their office and barely interact with us. And some actually had a conversation with us. So that was definitely interesting. But we also travel around the world. There's one of my favorite episodes, they're all my favorite, but one of my favorite episodes is the final episode, which is on the militarization of police. And we travel to Bangladesh, and we travel to France for the May Day protests, and we also go to a police arms fair in Germany to look at some of the weapons that they're using. So that has quite a bit of reporting in that, and it was definitely I learned a lot. It's very different to what I normally work on, the documentaries that we normally make. I mean, we do, of course, there's always elements of accountability and speaking to people who've been impacted by whatever it is that we're talking about and the imbalances of power. But this is very information, like you're learning a lot from this very information heavy documentary. And so I definitely enjoyed, and the team that I worked with were absolutely fantastic. So I have to really take my hat off to them, because there's a team there that did a fantastic job in producing this and getting it all together.
Well, then we have something to look forward to. Hind, thank you so much for making the time today.
Thank you for having me.
The Kicker is brought to you by the Columbia Journalism Review and produced by Amanda Dara. I'm your host, Josh Hirsch.